Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Recently, the Frank Fryer put up a video on the subject of manning up, or manhood, and a link in the description. And after sharing some thoughts with him, he suggested that I make my own video on the subject, so, well, here it is. The thing is, the approach to this that I want to take kind of has to start a bit back. So before I can talk about the subject of manning up, I first have to sort of lay some groundwork. So in particular, about the nature of being a human being and the purpose of a human being, or more properly, the purposes. And I'm painting in very big picture, very broad strokes, purposes. Because there are basically two purposes to a human being. The first of which is to enjoy the goodness of God, to enjoy the glory of God, however exactly you want to put it. But God, in his glory, in his fullness of his being, is good, is glorious and enjoyable. And to get a sense of this, all things that we enjoy within the created world are some small reflection of the goodness of God. So that gives a sense, if you take everything good about everything enjoyable whatsoever within the world, and that's a small reflection of the goodness of God. It gives you a sense of what I mean by enjoying God, the glory of God, the goodness of God. But that's not the only thing, because if that were the only purpose, that would be satisfied by something that borders on solipsism, where each individual is created having only a relationship to God and no relationship to anything else. And in that circumstance, all knowledge would come directly from God. Everything would come directly from God. There'd be no contact, no interaction of any kind with anything else. But there is. And so you have to look at what's that other purpose, what's that second purpose for which there is this interaction between that which is created. And that purpose is, very interestingly, I like to call it delegation. It's the technical name for it is secondary causation. But I don't think that's very helpful. Delegation is, I think, much more useful for the following reason. In practical terms, not academic terms, much more useful for practice. And that's because if you look at any action which is good, such as, feeding somebody who is hungry, or even better yet, a man and woman procreate and create a new person. This is actually one of the most striking ways in which human beings are an image of God, an imago Dei in the Latin. For two people create another person so that they can give to that new person. It is a tremendous image, a rather striking image, of how God creates us in order to give to us more. So it is, however, here the delegation of the creation of that person. God delegates it to the man and the woman to together make this person. So God is sustaining all these things in their existence. God is the existence of these things. So he is creating them. In that sense, is the primary causation in the academic term. But he's given it to this man and this woman to make this child, to bring this child into existence. And so in doing so, they become part of God's creative act of the child. They become incorporated into God in this sense of becoming part of God's action. Now, what applies here applies in many other places, such as feeding somebody. For example, feeding a hungry person. What does food do? Food allows you to continue living. It's part of how you sustain your life. Eating food and then using the food is how you sustain your life. So feeding a person incorporates you into God's act of giving this person existence. It is as well a becoming part of God in the sense of becoming part of God's action. In the sort of patristic language, it is becoming sons by adoption. And you can see this too in, as I said, in all good things. To give one more example, giving somebody knowledge. Now, God could give knowledge directly to a person without any mediation of the outside world. God doesn't need creation in any way. But God gives it to creation to be God's gift. So when you tell somebody something, when you give a person knowledge, you're becoming God's gift of knowledge to that person. You are part of God's gift of knowledge to that person. And as such, you become part of God's action. And in that sense, are getting incorporated into God. So the second purpose for a human being, the first being to enjoy God, the second purpose is to be incorporated into God in the sense of incorporated into God's action, into God's gift of goodness to creation. So, we're obviously, we don't become uncreated or something like that. That's pure nonsense. But we do become part of God's act of creation. And so, in that sense, we become, again, using the patristic language, sons of God by adoption. That, by the way, I've got other videos on how evil is a privation, and this really helps you to see how evil is a privation. That is a negative, not a positive, a lack, not a real, not a substantial thing. So I'll also link my video on good and evil if you're interested in that. But I don't want to go down that rabbit hole now. The thing that relates to manning up, however, is that these two purposes of the human being, somewhat in very, very broad brushstrokes, describe the two stages of human development. When a human being is first born, they're purely receptive. They can't do anything for themselves. It's not strictly true, because, they do breathe. But basically, that's why I say broad strokes. They can't do anything for themselves, and then eventually they become able to do things not only for themselves, but for others. And then once they hit that point, you can see sort of along, well, probably makes more sense to go that way for you guys. But so, from birth, moving on, there's birth and then childhood, and it gets less purely receptive to an admixture of being receptive and being active. And so the concept of manning up requires one other thing, and that is the understanding, the concept of manning up as we have it within our society requires one other thing to really put it in the proper context, which is that in this fallen world, we're not very good at both receiving and giving at the same time. Usually we have to do one or the other. We have to either enjoy the goodness of God or give to some other part of creation. It's very hard to do both simultaneously. If you're really, really understanding things completely properly, I will point out, you can sort of do both in that the giving, because you understand it as being incorporating you into God's action, is itself your attention is actually on an act of God's goodness, and therefore you can actually enjoy God's goodness in the act of doing this giving. But that's if you really, really understand this, not just at an intellectual level, but fully, completely throughout yourself, in the entirety of your being, understand this. That's incidentally how Christ nailed to the cross can be the happiest man alive. But if you're not all the way at that extreme of saintliness, you're going to, in order to give to another, direct your attention away from God's goodness. That is to say, away from enjoyment. That is, basically speaking, that the act of doing good is going to be also simultaneously an act of suffering. That is to say, it's going to be an act of sacrifice. Now, this basically means that adulthood is the phase in life in which we learn to sacrifice ourselves. As I said, in the fullest sense, we're not becoming less, actually, but in our fallen state, this is basically what it seems to us in the moment, that we are becoming less, that someone else might become more. And as such, sacrifice is inextricably bound to adulthood, in this sense, to that second phase wherein we grow out of the childhood of pure receptivity into the adulthood of giving as well as receiving. So becoming an adult is coming to grips with the need to sacrifice and the action of sacrifice. That, and this ties in actually to what Father Nicholas, the Frank Friar, was saying, that one needs to come to the point of being willing to sacrifice for others. There's another thing, and this gets to, everything I've said so far has been purely applies to males and females. But there is, when you come to the specifics of what that giving looks like in an adult, here's where you start to actually see a bit, both give, but both males and females give, but you see the expression of it is a little different in both cases. And this is where the most prototypical, most archetypal of the masculine virtues is strength. Now, obviously both males and females have physical strength. Both are capable of picking things up and moving things and so on. But when you think of an archetypal male who has all of the masculine virtues, one of the things that really tends to stand out is strength. And the interesting thing about this is all exercises of strength are also acts of suffering. At least if you've ever been to the gym, you know this. To strain with your muscles, to push hard with your muscles, hurts. You also know it doesn't. I mean, this also is kind of one of those good lessons in, pain isn't that bad. It's not that big a deal. I mean, it can really hurt. I mean, if you actually lift weights, like heavy weights at the gym, it can really hurt for a moment. Then it's over, and it doesn't really matter because, the important thing is that you're actually getting stronger. The same thing is true if you're not lifting weights simply for the purpose of getting stronger, but for helping somebody. Carrying a heavy thing hurts. It also doesn't matter. It's not a big deal. It doesn't, cause any lasting damage. Nothing's, the mere fact that it hurts doesn't really matter. What matters is that you've accomplished something for somebody. When you're carrying heavy things for a friend, what matters is that you've moved the heavy things, that friend has benefited from it, not that it hurt a little bit while you did it. But so this is, I think, very important to realize, though, the way that the exercise of strength and pain are necessary concomitants. The strain of muscle against bone and so on, it's perceived as pain, but it's not damage as such. It's just the exercise of strength. It's extreme, and therefore the nerves, which are there to sense extreme stress, sense the extreme stress and relay this, and we understand it as pain, but we also know that it doesn't cause any damage, and therefore it doesn't matter. It is, however, still an act of sacrifice, both in time as well as effort, and it involves a certain amount of suffering. And as such, you can see this prototypical masculine virtue of strength as being inextricably bound to sacrifice. That is to say, to really learn to be a man in the full sense is to learn to sacrifice, precisely because the masculine virtues are all ones of sacrifice. Same is true, just in somewhat different ways of the feminine virtues too, by the way. But I'm here actually talking about the masculine stuff specifically, rather than the universals. And so this, I think, is the context that's needed to understand the idea of manning up. That to man up is to transition from that initial stage of passive receptivity to an active stage of working as well as being receptive, of being active as well as being receptive. Now, I should point out that the vocation of fatherhood is by no means the only way to be a fully human adult male. And it's actually kind of ironic that Father Nicholas didn't mention this, but two very good ways of being a fully human adult male is by being a consecrated religious, a monk or a friar, or by being a priest. Now, both of these, incidentally, involve a great deal of work, just as biological fatherhood involves a great deal of work. They both involve a great deal of sacrifice for the good of some other part of creation, just as being a biological father involves a great deal of sacrifice for the good of creation, at least if you're doing it halfway right. Or even a quarter way right, it's still going to involve a lot of suffering and sacrifice. And the more right you're doing it to a great degree, the more suffering and sacrifice it involves. Because children need a great deal. There's a great deal that they can accept from you and a great deal you have to give to them. So there's a tremendous amount you're going to be giving to them if you're doing it right. And therefore a tremendous amount of fun you're not really going to be having as you're giving them all these things. Again, due to the fallen human nature, the better you are, the more you will enjoy the act of giving to them. So I don't mean that in the sense of discouraging biological fatherhood or saying that biological fatherhood inherently sucks. It's just we're all fallen, and so to the degree that we're fallen is the degree that it inherently sucks. The better, the more you get life right, the better it goes. But it's very important, especially in a modern context where civil society gives no support to parents to get through all of the parts that suck. Especially you can really see this in the way easy divorce is so commonly pushed, that marriage is going to contain parts that suck in a fallen world. And again, the better both people are, the less it will suck. But nonetheless, we're fallen, we're all sinful creatures, so there are going to be parts that suck. And in general, the only support that really works to get people through things that suck is either something incredibly strong to show you how much better things will be if you get through this, or what often is even more effective, showing you how much worse it can get than if you stick through things. And that's where the society, which used to, at the very least, frown very heavily on divorce, at least provided the idea that, like, things are going to be really bad for you if you break up your marriage and go your separate ways, that society is going to treat you very, very badly. And in so doing, they were supporting you actually staying in that marriage, because through, whatever, when you're both weak, when one of you is weak, what have you, and things suck, knowing that it can get a hell of a lot worse and you're just going to stick through this because at least it's not that bad, will get you through to the good side, and then things get much better. Easy divorces, I won't get into the sociological things, and I really don't care about the people who are going to leave comments with their ideological, but divorce actually makes things so much better. Tell yourself whatever lies you want. But if you actually face reality, divorce does make things worse, just not quite immediately. So it's one of those things where it's sort of a trap, because it looks like it makes things better, and then everything gets a lot worse. Anyway, in that society that does not support marriage, and you don't have to look very far to see examples in which people can be very badly screwed over by how things fail, it's worth very much, if the vocation of biological parenthood doesn't seem all that attractive to you, it may well be because you're not cut out for it. And instead that you are cut out for one of the other virtues. And so it's very much worth looking into those. There's also the committed single life. Oh, it's complicated. Anyway, until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.